we were a universe of people that were at risk of male violence. And so that whether we had been victimized or not was not as important as the fact that we all could be, and therefore we were basically all in this struggle together.
Development of the domestic violence advocacy movement was not a singular event in history, but rather a series of continuous, evolving, spontaneous events that led to a sequence of happenings across the nation. It was hard for the silence to be broken because there was this sentiment across the country that what was happening in homes was personal and private. It was not something to be shared in the public preview.
You have to go back to the very basic thought that the violence that women were experiencing in their homes was a social problem, and also that there was that strong belief that there should be no government intervention into family life.
Women began to break the silence about domestic violence in intimate, quiet conversations in small groups.
But once we came together and began these conversations, they grew. It grew from two people talking together to four women coming to church and finding out that we were not alone, that it wasn't just me that was experiencing this, it was us.
There was no resources at all for women who were in my situation. The whole classic example of women going to the law enforcement, and law enforcement were friends of the abuser. You know, we just didn't find any relief at all in our own home, in our communities.
Reflecting back, and I come from a rural state, I think our calls for domestic violence were much higher than maybe some people think they were in the 70s. It's just that we responded in a rather non-involved fashion.
Money came, support from members of the faith community and from the legal system came, but we were too few and we had so much work to do. We needed more people and more time, but I think that we were absolutely optimistic that given time and given expansion, if you will, of the workers, that we in fact could end violence against women. In the mid-70s, those folks who were running women's hotlines began to understand that the battered women who were calling needed places to go.
We needed food, we needed clothing. Very much women and children who were coming to the shelters would leave in the middle of the night, leaving everything they owned behind. So when they arrived at the shelter, what they had was merely the clothes on their backs, if they had that.
We also had to address the issues of addiction. Women who became alcoholic to numb their pain or to be able to live in that, to continue to live in that battering relationship.
And so women began offering bedrooms or basement floors. Some churches began offering sanctuary in much the same way they were offering sanctuary for those who were draft resistors.
As the shelter developed, none of us in law enforcement quite knew what the shelter was about. It seemed to be kind of a mysterious area, a lot of confidentiality.
We started out with $5 contributions. Those $5 contributions are still very important. We started out with people giving their extra furniture, and some of it was very decrepit, but it was better than the floor.
There was a period in the mid-'80s where we began to see systems begin to shift more toward support and understanding. It was not an easy transition. It was a transition that took place as a result of very hard-working effort by domestic violence advocates.
Protection orders were being issued, but they weren't being enforced. Police officers would go out to the home, but they would not arrest. Women would go to doctors who would never ask them, how many doors can you run into in the last year?
Even now, it still happens, but certainly more so then, the doctors just didn't see what was in front of them, or if they did, they didn't know what to do, or they chose to ignore it. And there are a number of complicated reasons for this. Part of it was just not being aware that domestic violence was as serious a problem, or they thought of it as a private matter, that's something they shouldn't be intervening, or it wasn't their purview as physicians to deal with social work problems.
Part of the problem was a lack of integration, but not only among the different legal systems between the civil system, the family court law system, and the criminal system. The juvenile court system, not communicating, not realizing we were all dealing with the same victims. We were dealing with the same families, but one hand was not aware of what was going on with the other hand.
The Tracy Thurman case changed for the future the way in which response from police would happen.
And Tracy Thurman suffered terrible violence and permanent injury while police officers basically looked on. And her attorney was able to persuade the courts in Connecticut that that was not acceptable anymore.
In the late 80s and 90s, we began to see the fruits of our labor in a number of ways. The recognition that you could, in fact, go into any place across the country and say domestic violence, and people understood. It was named, it was claimed, and it was understood that there was something wrong with it.
No Excuse campaign took off like wildfire. You could see there's no excuse for domestic violence on bumper stickers throughout this country. You could find no excuse material, posters, not just in shelters, but in hospitals, in City Hall, in doctors' offices. As a consequence, members of the community stepped forward and said, what can we do to help?
Well, let me read to you the words that really inspired me to get involved. And they are these. They leave their homes, their money, and often their children. Bruised and frightened, they run into the night with only their clothes on their backs. Well, if that doesn't move you in some way, if you can't picture that in your mind of someone you would love or someone you would know, then we're not a compassionate people.
One of the events that really brought the public lens to a focus on domestic violence was the O.J. Simpson case.
In the O.J. Simpson case, the biggest impact it had on us was that Nicole Brown was a battered woman and died as a result of it.
Even though he was not convicted on the criminal side, there was a holding of him accountable for his actions.
It was an opportunity that was a moment captured that propelled us into what we really needed, and that was the Violence Against Women Act.
Well, in 1994, the Violence Against Women Act, being a federal act, told law enforcement to sit up and pay attention. I think without that federal act, law enforcement would still be in the dark ages, would still be dragging their feet.
The Violence Against Women Act was the direct outcome of years of work and tireless energy and faithfulness to the cause. The belief that change would come and that change would happen and that change would, in fact, stop domestic violence. The place that we're in today, although a better place because there are more supports and resources, is not sufficient. It's not sufficient because women and children are still dying.
I think one of the most pivotal things is to remember that we need to be proactive versus reactive. You know, in a lot of different ways, our role was always to be reactive. We always were the persons who enforced once something happened, but I think we have to be more proactive.
Healthcare providers are used to being, particularly physicians, at the top of the hierarchy and feeling like they have all the expertise. And that's not true in domestic violence. Advocates and survivors are the ones with the real expertise on this issue. And it really means working collaboratively with community-based groups in really respectful, collaborative ways if they want to address this issue.
I'm becoming somewhat satisfied. A lot needs to be accomplished. A lot more needs to be done. I really think our law enforcement training academies need to devote more time to domestic violence training. I think that will happen, but I want more time spent on training officers, and not just how to do the simple mechanics, but actually to have a little compassion and concern and to generally assist the family and the children.
For me, the hope for the future is the children. We have to teach our children to be nonviolent. We have to take, as men and women, we have to really address the violence that the media brings into the home.
And the only way that we can continue the challenge is to do it together. It's to find a way that we can bring all communities together and to bring in all of our resources, to coordinate across systems, to work as a collective to end domestic violence in our lifetimes.
There is something about this violence that calls people to a place where it is your life, not your livelihood. It is your joy as well as a burden from time to time. And I think that many of the folks who are doing this work have had a passion for social justice all of their lives, and it sustains us. And in the meeting of others and working with others who come to this with such joy and such passion and such diligence, it's easy to stay. And it's a gift to be able to do this work.